Hi everyone, it's Future Dave. I just finished editing the video and felt like I should put together this short piece to explain a few things. When people hear Springfield Armory, they often assume the historic government arsenal and today's gun company are the same thing. They're not. The original Springfield Armory was a U.S. government facility established in 1794 at the order of George Washington. For nearly 175 years, it was the hub of American military small arms innovation, producing everything from the first standardized muskets to the M1 Garand and early versions of the M14. It wasn't just a factory, it was a design and testing center that shaped U.S. military firepower through multiple wars. In 1968, however, the Department of Defense shut it down as part of budget cuts. The historic site in Massachusetts became a museum and National Historic Site. The Springfield Armory that built America's battle rifles ceased to exist. 6 years later, in 1974, a private company in Illinois purchased the rights to the name Springfield Armory. This new Springfield Armory Incorporated is a commercial firearms manufacturer with no direct connection to the old arsenal. It sells civilian rifles like the M1A, modeled on the military M14, and handguns such as the XD series, like this, an XDM chambered in .45 caliber. It has a match-grade barrel and laser sight that makes my buddy Josh very jealous, and rightfully so. So when Springfield Armory is mentioned, context matters. The Federal Arsenal was a government institution that defined U.S. military small arms history until its closure. The modern Springfield Armory is a private business leveraging that name recognition. The two share a label, but not a lineage. Now on with the conspiracy. For more than a century, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department controlled what rifles American soldiers carried. It wasn't just a branch of the Army, it was a closed club. At the heart of that club was the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, the government arsenal that designed nearly every standard U.S. service rifle from the Revolution through the Cold War. By the mid-20th century, Springfield wasn't simply a factory, it was an institution, a symbol of continuity and tradition. Generations of ordnance officers built their careers there. It was a place where pedigree mattered more than ideas, where family ties and professional loyalties could carry as much weight as technical merit. Outsiders who tried to pitch new concepts were met with the same old cold response. Not invented here. Nepotism and insularity became the culture. Ordnance officers protected their turf and each other, treating innovation from commercial gun makers with suspicion or outright hostility. John Garand himself, whose M1 rifle would become legendary, had fought years of bureaucratic resistance inside Springfield before his design was accepted. If that was how they treated one of their own, a self-taught machinist who worked behind Springfield's doors, outsiders had little chance. The mindset wasn't just bureaucratic pride, it was doctrine. Ordnance men believed the American soldier was defined by his rifle, and that rifle was defined by tradition. Full power .30 caliber cartridges were sacrosanct. Long-range accuracy was more important than volume of fire. Walnut stocks and steel receivers weren't just materials. They were symbols of seriousness, proof that the rifle in a soldier's hands was built to last. Anything lighter, cheaper, or unfamiliar was treated as a gimmick. The results of this philosophy were mixed. Sometimes Springfield delivered brilliance, as with the M1 Garand. Other times it delivered mediocrity, as with the Krag Jorgensen of the 1890s. But whatever the outcome, Springfield's authority was never questioned. Congress funded it, Ordnance defended it, and the myth grew that America's best rifles were born there, even when history said otherwise. Consider the Springfield M1903. Hailed as an American masterpiece, it was in reality a German design in disguise. So close to the Mauser Model 1898 that the U.S. government was forced to pay royalties to Mauser Werke for patent infringement. The episode was an embarrassment, but instead of humbling Ordnance, it only hardened their insularity. The official story celebrated Springfield's brilliance. The truth was buried in technical journals and legal settlements. The lessons for ordnance wasn't learn from outsiders, it was protect the legend. By the 1950s, that legend was wearing thin. The battlefield had changed, mobility, volume of fire, and close-range combat mattered more than long-range accuracy. Other nations saw it. Germany had fielded the Sturmgewehr in World War II. The Soviets had adopted the AK-47. The British were pushing for intermediate calibers like the .280. Yet the United States remained welded to Springfield's philosophy. Bigger was better, wood and steel were sacred, and the next rifle would be designed at Springfield no matter what. This conservatism wasn't just technical, it was political. Ordnance had allies in Congress and prestige in the Army. Generals who had fought World War II trusted Springfield because it had delivered the Garand. Tradition became policy, and policy became dogma. The institution saw no reason to change, and every reason to resist change proposed by anyone else. That culture is where the M16 story begins. Not in the jungles of Vietnam, not in Eugene Stoner's workshop, but in the marble offices and oak-paneled conference rooms of the Ordnance Department, where rifles were chosen less by battlefield need than by institutional pride. The men who guarded Springfield's legacy were about to face a rifle that broke every one of their rules. And when it threatened their authority, they would fight it not on the merits, but with politics, sabotage, and lies. The Ordnance Department liked to present Springfield Armory as the crown jewel of American ingenuity, but the truth was more complicated. Springfield's most famous creation before the Garand was the M1903 rifle. Wasn't even fully American. It was, in many respects, a copy of the German Mauser. The story begins in the Spanish-American War of 1898. American troops went into battle with the Krag-Jorgensen rifle, a Norwegian design adopted in the 1890s. It was smooth and accurate, but its magazine loaded slowly, one round at a time. Facing Spanish forces armed with Mauser 1893 rifles, U.S. soldiers quickly realized they were outclassed. The Spanish could load 5 rounds at once using stripper clips, fire a flat-shooting 7x57mm cartridge, and maintain a higher rate of accurate fire. American casualties piled up, in part because their weapons simply couldn't keep pace. Ordnance officers took notice, but instead of adopting the Mauser or licensing it outright, Springfield borrowed heavily from the German design. The M1903 rifle that entered U.S. service a few years later looked distinct on the outside, but functioned almost identically on the inside. Dual front locking lugs, a 5-round stripper clip-fed magazine, and a controlled feed bolt were all Mauser hallmarks. The similarities were so obvious that Mauser-Werke sued. The U.S. government quickly settled, agreeing to pay royalties for every 1903 produced until America entered World War I. This was an embarrassing moment. America's supposed to be homegrown masterpiece had to be licensed from a foreign rival. For Ordnance, the scandal should have been a lesson in humility, proof that Springfield wasn't infallible, and that better ideas could come from abroad. Instead, the department closed ranks. The royalties were paid, the lawsuit settled, but the official narrative remained. The M1903 was a Springfield triumph. The fact that it was a Mauser in disguise was buried in the fine print. The consequences of that episode went deeper than legal fees. It hardened Springfield's belief that image mattered more than honesty. The Armory's prestige had to be protected at all costs. The Springfield-only culture grew stronger. Outsiders with competing designs were treated with even more suspicion. If Springfield had borrowed once, it would never admit to borrowing again. Ironically, the M1903 did prove itself in combat. It was accurate, reliable, and admired by soldiers and Marines in World War I. Snipers loved it. Marksmen swore by it. The rifle's battlefield success made it easy to paper over its borrowed origins. But the myth built around it, that Springfield alone was the wellspring of American rifle design, had corrosive effects. It created an institution unwilling to learn from others, even as the rest of the world was moving in new directions. By World War II, that myth had calcified into doctrine. The Garand, genuinely innovative this time, reinforced it. Springfield was seen not just as a workshop, but as a symbol of national pride. proof that American rifles were always the best. No mention was made of the royalties once paid to Germany, no acknowledgement that the U.S. had been outclassed by Mausers in 1898. Those inconvenient truths had been erased from the story. This culture of myth-making set the stage for what was to come. When Eugene Stoner appeared decades later with a rifle that broke every tradition, small caliber, aluminum receivers, plastic stocks, Ordnance would fight not just against the weapon, but against what it symbolized. To admit that a private engineer from outside Springfield had designed something better would have shattered the legacy they had been polishing since 1903. And that was something they could not allow. The Garand has given Springfield its greatest victory. General George S. Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. And in World War II, it gave U.S. infantrymen a clear edge. That success cast a long shadow. When the time came to replace it, the Ordnance Department didn't want a revolution. They wanted another Garand, only bigger, heavier, and supposedly better. That thinking produced the M14. On the surface, it looked like progress. Instead of an 8-round clip, it had a detachable 20-round box magazine. It was chambered in the new 7.62 by 51 NATO cartridge, the short 30-06 that America had strong-armed its allies into adopting. It was select fire, giving soldiers the option of semi-automatic or full automatic fire. But peel back the layers and it was the Garand all over again. A gas-operated, wood-stocked battle rifle designed around the belief that the American rifleman's job was to shoot full-power cartridges at long range. That belief looked fine on a test range. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, it was a disaster. The M14 was too heavy, tipping the scales at nearly 11 pounds with a loaded magazine. Soldiers on long patrols cursed the burden. Its full-power 7.62 NATO round gave it punishing recoil, and in automatic fire, the rifle was virtually uncontrollable. The muzzle climbed skyward after 2 or 3 shots, making full auto a meaningless feature. The Army's answer was to issue most rifles with the automatic setting disabled, quietly admitting the M14 could not do what it had been advertised to do. Then there were the materials. Springfield had insisted on walnut stocks, proud symbols of durability and craftsmanship. In Vietnam's humidity, those stocks swelled and warped. Accuracy suffered, and in some cases rifles became unreliable. Marines experimented with fiberglass replacements, but the damage to the rifle's reputation had been done. In the conditions that mattered the most, the M14 was a liability. Logistics compounded the problem. The 7.62 NATO was heavy, limiting how much ammunition a soldier could carry. A typical infantryman might haul 100 or 120 rounds. An enemy fighter with an AK-47 could carry twice that. In firefights where volume often mattered more than precision, the American rifleman found himself outgunned simply because his cartridges were larger and heavier. Reports from the field told the story plainly. The M14 was ill-suited for Vietnam. Advisors embedded with South Vietnamese units noticed the local troops armed with lighter rifles moved more easily in the jungle than Americans weighed down by the M14. Soldiers complained that it was too long, too heavy, and too slow to bring to bear in close-range ambushes. Yet back in Washington, ordnance officers defended it with the same mantra they had used for decades. Best rifle in the world. The truth was that the M14 represented a philosophy already out of date. Ordnance had built a weapon for a European battlefield of open fields and long-range engagements. They had ignored the lessons of Korea and the data from Project Salvo, showing most firefights happened at short range. They had clung to wood and steel when the future was pointing towards lighter materials. And they had invested too much institutional pride in the 7.62 NATO to back away. In the end, the M14 was a rifle that did everything on paper and nothing well in practice. It was supposed to be a battle rifle, a squad automatic weapon, and even a carbine replacement. It failed at all three. It was too heavy as a rifle, uncontrollable as an automatic weapon, and absurdly overpowered as a carbine substitute. It satisfied the Ordnance Department's paper requirements, but frustrated the soldiers who had to carry it. By 1963, its fate was already sealed. The M14 had lasted barely 4 years as the official U.S. service rifle, one of the shortest reigns in American history. For Ordnance, it was the last triumph of Springfield culture, a final attempt to force tradition onto a changing battlefield. For the men who carried it in Vietnam, it was proof that the old guard had lost touch. The failure of the M14 set the stage for something radically different. Springfield had delivered in the past. The future was waiting in the hands of an engineer who had never set foot in the Ordnance Club, Eugene Stoner. The failure of the M14 created a vacuum, but the solution didn't come from Springfield Armory or the Ordnance Department. It came from an aircraft company in California and an engineer who thought about rifles the way he thought about airplanes, as machines that had to be light, efficient, and brutally practical. His name was Eugene Stoner, and he was about to rewrite the rules of American small arms. Stoner wasn't a career ordnance man. He hadn't grown up in Springfield's shadow. He had been a machinist and a toolmaker before moving into engineering, eventually landing at Fairchild Aircraft. In the 1950s, Fairchild created a small division called Armalite, intended to act as kind of a skunk works, a place where experimental concepts could be explored without the weight of tradition. Unlike Springfield, Armalite had no prestige to protect. It had to innovate to survive. Stoner's approach reflected that freedom. Where Springfield engineers defaulted to walnut and steel, Stoner reached for aluminum and composite plastics. Where Springfield clung to the battle rifle tradition, Stoner studied the realities of modern combat: short-range firefights, soldiers overloaded with gear, the need for controllable automatic fire. He designed with the mindset of someone who had built airplanes, not heirlooms. Every ounce saved mattered. Every angle was calculated for efficiency. The result was the AR-10. Chambered at 7.62 NATO, it was lighter and sleeker than the M14, with a straight-line stock that aligned the recoil with the shooter's shoulder and minimized muzzle climb. Its receiver was aluminum, its furniture synthetic, and its operation relied on a direct gas system that vented gas straight into the bolt carrier rather than using a heavy piston. To traditionalists, it looked flimsy, even toy-like. To those who fired it, it felt revolutionary. The AR-10 never stood a chance with Ordnance. Trials were perfunctory, and a barrel failure in testing provided all the excuse needed to dismiss it. The M14 had already been chosen, and the gatekeepers weren't about to admit they'd made a mistake. But the design itself was too promising to disappear. Armalite realized that if the rifle could be scaled down to a smaller caliber, it might offer everything the M14 could not: lightweight, controllability, and firepower soldiers could actually use in the field. The realization produced the AR-15. By shrinking the AR-10 to fire the new .223 Remington cartridge, Stoner created a rifle that embodied his design philosophy to its fullest. It weighed barely 6 pounds, fired with almost no recoil, and allowed soldiers to carry twice as much ammunition as those armed with the M14. In automatic fire, it was controllable. In semi-automatic, it was accurate at the ranges that actually mattered. The AR-15 wasn't just a new rifle, it was a new way of thinking about what a rifle should be. When first demonstrated, it drew the same skeptical looks the AR-10 had. The black anodized receiver, the plastic furniture, the small cartridge. To many eyes it resembled a toy, not a weapon of war. But the soldiers who tested it came away with different impressions. They could fire it faster, hit more often, and carry more rounds. Compared to the M14, it felt like the difference between lugging a sledgehammer and handling a scalpel. The Air Force, led by General Curtis LeMay, saw its potential immediately. For pilots and security forces, a lightweight rifle with high firepower made perfect sense. Special Forces operators in Vietnam who managed to get their hands on the AR-15 reported back that it was ideally suited for jungle combat. Word spread quickly, and Colt, which had purchased the rights from Armalite, began marketing the rifle aggressively to the military. But for the Ordnance Department, the AR-15 was hearsay. It broke every rule Springfield had lived by: small caliber, aluminum and plastic construction, a radical gas system. Accepting it would mean admitting that Springfield's last great design, the M14, had been a mistake. And it would mean ceding the future of American rifles to outsiders. For the Old Guard, that was unthinkable. Still, the AR-15 had momentum. It was lighter, cheaper, and more efficient than the M14. It fit the needs of Vietnam better than the weapon Springfield had forced into service. The only thing standing in its way was institutional pride. And pride, as soldiers in the jungle were discovering, didn't stop bullets. The AR-15 was everything the Ordnance Department said a rifle shouldn't be. It was small caliber, lightweight, and built from materials that made traditionalists scoff. To Springfield's Old Guard, it wasn't just a rifle, it was an insult. And when insulted, Ordnance didn't debate, it buried. The most obvious target was the cartridge. The AR-15 fired the .223 Remington, a high-velocity, lightweight round designed to take advantage of Project Salvo's research, showing that more, smaller bullets increased hit probability. Ballistic gel tests showed it tumbled and fragmented on impact, producing more wounds as lethal, or even more destructive than the heavier 7.62 NATO. More importantly, soldiers could carry nearly twice the ammunition load at the same weight. In every practical sense, the .223 made sense for modern combat. But ordnance officers refused to see it that way. To them, a .22 caliber bullet was for varmints, not for war. They argued that anything less than .30 caliber lacked stopping power, even though evidence and field reports contradicted them. Tradition had become doctrine. The American rifleman was a long-range marksman, and he carried a full-power cartridge. The fact that most firefights happened inside 300 yards, where the M14's supposed superiority meant nothing, was ignored. Ordnance's position wasn't just about ballistics, it was about pride and power. The M14, their rifle, was still in production. Admitting the AR-15 was better would mean admitting the M14 was obsolete before it even finished rolling off assembly lines. Worse, it would mean conceding that Springfield Armory no longer held the monopoly on innovation. For a bureaucracy that had controlled small arms for over a century, that was unthinkable. So the knives came out. Field trials of the AR-15 were manipulated to produce negative results. Reports that highlighted its accuracy, reliability, and soldier preference were buried or reworded. Any malfunctions were emphasized as proof the rifle was fragile. The plastic toy narrative was repeated endlessly in official memos. Ordnance officers claimed the aluminum receiver would crack in combat, the composite stock would shatter, and the small cartridge would bounce off jungle brush. None of these claims held up in independent tests, but they served their purpose, to slow the rifle's momentum. Meanwhile, the AR-15 was quietly winning converts. The Air Force, under General Curtis LeMay, ordered thousands for base security forces. Special Forces units deployed in Vietnam used them in the field and praised their performance. Soldiers armed with the AR-15s could move faster, fire more accurately, and sustain firefights longer than those burdened with the M14. The contrast was obvious to anyone who carried both rifles, and damning to Ordnance's position. The caliber war that had begun in NATO conferences now became an internal U.S. battle. On one side stood Ordnance, clinging to the 7.62 NATO as a matter of institutional pride. On the other stood reformers, data analysts, and field commanders pointing to real-world evidence that the AR-15's small caliber concept was superior. In the middle were the soldiers, who didn't care about theory or prestige. They cared about what worked in the jungle, and what worked was the lightweight black rifle. But Ordnance still had the power of bureaucracy. They controlled the testing process, the reports sent to Congress, and the recommendations to Army leadership. Their strategy was to delay and discredit, hoping that time and tradition would keep the M14 entrenched. Every malfunction in an AR-15 was highlighted, every success minimized. Colt, which had purchased the rights to the rifle from Armalite, fought back with demonstrations and lobbying, but they were against a century of institutional inertia. What Ordnance didn't account for was that they no longer held the only seat at the table. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and his whiz kids, were watching the debate closely, and they weren't impressed with Ordnance's arguments. To them, the data mattered more than tradition, and the data showed that the AR-15 wasn't just competitive with the M14, it was superior. Still, Ordnance did everything possible to protect its turf. The rifle that would become the M16 was caught in the crossfire, not just between two calibers, but between two worldviews. One rooted in the past, the other in the future. Soldiers in Vietnam were already discovering which worldview matched reality. But back in Washington, the establishment was more determined to bury the rifle before it buried them. Robert McNamara didn't care about tradition. He didn't care about Springfield Armory's century of prestige or about the Old Guard's belief that only a .30 caliber rifle was worthy of the American infantryman. He cared about numbers. Before becoming Secretary of Defense, McNamara had turned Ford Motor Company around with his obsession for efficiency and data. When he walked into the Pentagon in 1961, he brought that same cold calculus with him. To Ordnance, McNamara was a nightmare. For decades, they had controlled rifle procurement with near total autonomy. Springfield designed, Ordnance approved, Congress funded. Now, for the first time in living memory, a civilian outsider was demanding proof that their decisions made sense on paper. And the M14 didn't make sense. By the early 1960s, it was already in trouble. Production was sluggish and expensive. The rifle cost more to build than promised, rolled off the lines in fewer numbers than projected, and required specialized tooling that slowed everything down. The weapon that was supposed to replace the Garand had taken more than a decade to deliver and was still nowhere near equipping the whole Army. Worse, field reports from Vietnam were damning. Too heavy, too long, too hard to control in automatic fire, and prone to stock warping and humidity. McNamara's analysts, his whiz kids as they were nicknamed, pored over the data. They compared production numbers, cost per unit, soldier reports, and test results. Then they compared those numbers to the AR-15. The differences were glaring. The AR-15 could be produced faster and cheaper. It was lighter, more controllable, and allowed soldiers to carry twice the ammunition. In range tests, troops fired it more accurately. In combat trials, it simply outperformed the M14. For Ordnance, this was hearsay. They had fought tooth and nail to standardize the 7.62 NATO across NATO. They had pushed the M14 as the ultimate evolution of the Garand. Admitting that a plastic and aluminum rifle firing a varmint cartridge was better would mean admitting they had wasted years, millions of dollars, and their credibility. So they doubled down. They told Congress the AR-15 was unreliable. They argued that 5.56 lacked stopping power. They claimed the aluminum receiver would crack in the field. And they insisted that abandoning 7.62 would fracture NATO unity. But McNamara wasn't interested in myths or prestige. He wanted efficiency. He wanted numbers. And the numbers told him that the M14 was a dead end. In 1963, he made the decision that would change American small arms forever. He ordered a halt to the M14 production and directed that the AR-15 be adopted as the Army's new service rifle. For Ordnance, it was a humiliation. Their authority had been challenged before, but never like this. The Secretary of Defense had overridden their judgment, stripped their prize rifle from their hands, and handed the future to an outsider's design. Springfield Armory, once the unquestioned cathedral of American rifles, suddenly looked obsolete. The fallout was immediate. Critics accused McNamara of meddling in military affairs he didn't understand. Supporters praised him for cutting through the fog of bureaucracy. Inside the ranks, the reaction was mixed. Some soldiers welcomed the AR-15, grateful for a rifle that was light and easy to handle. Others looked at the plastic stock and small cartridge and felt cheated, convinced they were being handed a toy instead of a weapon. For McNamara, none of that mattered. The procurement system had to change, and the AR-15 was the tool to do it. The decision wasn't just about rifles. It was about tearing power away from the old ordnance clique and putting it under centralized, data-driven control. Within 5 years, Springfield Armory itself would be shuttered. The monopoly was over. But if McNamara thought his decision had settled the matter, he was wrong. The rifle he had forced into service was about to face its most dangerous test, not from trials or procurement boards, but from combat in Vietnam. And thanks to bureaucratic sabotage, poor planning, and outright lies, American soldiers would pay the price. When the M16 first arrived in Vietnam, it should have been a triumph. It was light, accurate, and controllable in automatic fire. Soldiers could carry twice the ammunition of their M14 armed comrades. Special Forces teams and Air Force personnel who tested it swore by it. On paper, Robert McNamara's decision to force the rifle into service looked vindicated. But in practice, the way the rifle was deployed turned its promise into betrayal. The problems began before the rifles even left the factory. Ordnance officers, bitter about losing the fight to keep the M14, dragged their feet in supporting the new weapon. Maintenance manuals were poorly written, spare parts were scarce. Most damning of all, soldiers were told that the M16 was self-cleaning. It was a lie, repeated so often in official literature that young troops believed it. Cleaning kits weren't even issued with the first rifles. When malfunctions began to occur, soldiers had no tools to fix them. The ammunition situation made things worse. The rifle had been designed to fire cartridges loaded with a clean-burning propellant, but the Army authorized a switch to a different powder that fouled the action much more quickly and increased the cyclic rate. The change was cheaper for suppliers, but catastrophic for reliability. In the heat and humidity of Vietnam, carbon and powder residue built up rapidly, and without chrome plating in the chamber or bore, corrosion made the problem worse. The results in combat were horrific. Rifles jammed in the middle of firefights, sometimes only after a few magazines. Extractors tore through swollen brass, leaving cases stuck in chambers. Soldiers found themselves with weapons that refused to fire just as the enemy closed in. In desperate moments, some were found dead with their rifles partially disassembled, cleaning rods jammed into the chambers as they tried to pry out stuck cartridges under fire. Word spread quickly among the troops. The rifle that was supposed to be their salvation was betraying them at the worst possible moments. They cursed the Mattel toy and scrawled bitter graffiti on the stocks. Rumors circulated that someone back in Washington had sabotaged the weapon. In a way, they weren't wrong. Because when complaints started piling up, Ordnance and Army leadership didn't rush to fix the problem. They closed ranks. Malfunctions were blamed on improper cleaning. Failures in combat were dismissed as soldier error. The missing cleaning kits, an oversight. The powder change, irrelevant, they said. Anything but admitting that decisions made in Washington had crippled the rifle in the field. The cover-up extended all the way to Congress. When hearings were first convened to investigate the complaints, Army representatives downplayed the severity of the problem. They insisted the rifle was sound and that troops were exaggerating. Meanwhile, letters from soldiers and Marines told a very different story. Parents received anguished notes from sons begging for cleaning supplies. Some families later testified their boys had died because the rifles failed them. Journalists picked up the trail, and photographs of rifles jammed with swollen cases appeared in newspapers. Public outrage grew. Congress demanded answers. Only then did the Army begin to acknowledge what the troops already knew. The rifle had been sent to war without the basics of support. No chrome lining, no cleaning kits, and the wrong powder. A trifecta of preventable mistakes, compounded by a culture more interested in saving face than saving lives. For the men in the field, it was too late. The M16 had earned a reputation as a weapon that couldn't be trusted. Stories of jams in combat became part of the folklore of Vietnam. Some soldiers went out of their way to trade for AK-47s, preferring the enemy's rifle over their own. In a war already mired in confusion and doubt, the M16 became a symbol of betrayal by the very institution that had sent them to fight. The tragedy is that the rifle itself wasn't the problem. When properly maintained with the right ammunition, it was accurate, deadly, and reliable. The failures weren't in the design, they were in the deployment. A powder change authorized for convenience, A refusal to issue cleaning kits and a cover-up of the resulting chaos turned a promising weapon into a scandal. The deaths that followed weren't caused by a defective rifle. They were caused by leadership that had refused to admit it had made mistakes. By 1967, the crisis had reached a breaking point. Congress demanded full investigations. Soldiers testified. Generals squirmed under questioning. The Army finally admitted that the wrong powder had been used, that chrome lining was needed, and that cleaning kits should have been issued from the start. The fixes were obvious, cheap, and overdue, but for the families of those who had already died, the damage could never be undone. The cover-up had done more than ruin the rifle's reputation. It had shattered trust. Troops who had already felt abandoned in the distant, unpopular war now believed their own leaders were willing to lie about the very weapons in their hands. For many Vietnam veterans, the sting of that betrayal never faded. The M16 could be fixed, but the faith that had been lost would not be so easily restored. By 1967, the scandal around the M16 could no longer be contained. Reports of malfunctions were piling up. Families of dead soldiers were writing letters to Congress describing how their sons had been betrayed by rifles that jammed in combat. Photographs of cleaning rods jammed into receivers began circulating in newspapers. The self-cleaning myth was dead, and the truth that the rifle had been sent into combat without the most basic support was undeniable. Congress responded with hearings. The House Armed Services Committee called soldiers, Marines, engineers, and generals to testify. What emerged in those sessions was a portrait of negligence, arrogance, and deliberate misrepresentation. Troops told blunt stories of firefights where the rifles had failed. Officers admitting that cleaning kits had not been issued with the first shipments. Engineers revealed that the Army had authorized a change in powder formulation that fouled the rifles faster and raised the rate of fire beyond safe limits. Ordnance officers tried to shift the blame. They claimed the problems were overstated. They suggested that soldiers simply weren't cleaning their rifles properly. When pressed, they insisted that the M16 was a sound design and that any failures were isolated. But the evidence stacked against them. Ballistic experts presented data showing that the switch to dirtier ball powder dramatically increased fouling. Armorers confirmed that the lack of chrome lining left chambers vulnerable to corrosion and stuck cases. Every excuse Ordnance offered was dismantled under questioning. The cover-up was exposed for what it was, a bureaucracy protecting itself. The Army had chosen to mislead soldiers with the self-cleaning claim rather than admit the rifle required maintenance. It had authorized a propellant change without proper testing. It had failed to issue cleaning kits, and when rifles failed in combat, it had blamed the troops instead of owning its mistakes. Congress made sure those failures were on the record. The scandal embarrassed the Pentagon, but it also forced action. A series of fixes were implemented that transformed the M16 from a liability into a reliable service weapon. Chrome plating was added to the chamber and bore, reducing corrosion and easing extraction. Cleaning kits were issued with every rifle, along with training that emphasized maintenance as critical to survival. The ammunition was reformulated with the original stick powder the design had been built around. Small design tweaks improved durability and reliability. These changes culminated in the adoption of the M16A1. To troops in the field, the difference was night and day. Malfunctions plummeted, reliability improved dramatically. Soldiers who had once cursed the Mattel toy began to appreciate its accuracy, lightweight, and controllability. It didn't erase the bitter memories of those who had been failed by the early rifles, but it gave the weapon a second chance. Colt, eager to protect its contract, mounted its own campaign to salvage the rifle's reputation. Demonstrations were staged to show off the fixed M16A1. Reporters and lawmakers were invited to fire it, and most came away impressed. The narrative began to shift. Where once the M16 had been a symbol of betrayal, it now showed signs of becoming the rifle it had always promised to be: fast, accurate, and lethal in the conditions of Vietnam. The hearings also changed the way Americans thought about procurement. The exposure of the cover-up shattered confidence in ordnance. Soldiers had been told lies. Congress had been misled. The consequences were deadly. When Springfield Armory was shuttered in 1968, it was more than just a budget decision. It was a symbolic end to the era when ordnance could act as law unto itself. Never again would the Army's rifle program operate with that level of unchecked authority. For the men on the ground, the fixes came too late to erase the bitterness. Many Vietnam veterans carried the memory of friends killed because their rifles failed them. They remembered cleaning rods jammed into rifles under fire, desperate attempts to clear jams while the enemy advanced. Even after the rifle was fixed, that memory lingered. The M16's reputation would always carry the scar of its introduction. But it also carried proof that the rifle itself had never been the enemy. Once the lies were stripped away and the politics cut out, the M16 showed its true value. It was accurate, lightweight, and perfectly suited for the kind of warfare America was fighting. If it had been supported properly from the beginning, it might have been hailed as a triumph. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about bureaucracy, arrogance, and the cost of cover-ups measured in lives. By the end of the 1960s, the black rifle had been redeemed in the field, if not in memory. The M16A1 became standard issue, and soldiers carried it through the rest of the war with confidence. It had taken congressional investigations, public outrage, and countless avoidable deaths to get there, but the weapon that had once been cursed was finally fulfilling its promise. The hearings had stripped away the myths, the excuses, and the lies. By 1967 and 68, the Army and Marines had no choice but to fix the rifle or abandon it altogether. And once the M16 was properly supported, it began to prove what Eugene Stoner and its early advocates had claimed all along, that it was the right rifle for the war America was actually fighting. The first wave of changes, chrome plating in the chamber and bore, cleaning kits issued to every soldier, propellant reformulated to match the original specs, turned the M16 from an unreliable liability into a functional weapon. Malfunctions plummeted. Troops who had once cursed it in anger began to notice how well it performed when maintained correctly. It was accurate, fast handling, and controllable in automatic fire. Most importantly, it was light. In Vietnam's jungles, that mattered more than anything. For soldiers who had carried the M14, the difference was night and day. The black rifle was half the weight, easier to maneuver in tight terrain, and allowed them to carry twice as much ammunition. Instead of humping 100 rounds of heavy 7.62, they could carry 200 rounds of 5.56 and still move faster. Firefights that had once left them running low on ammunition now gave them the ability to sustain fire. The psychological difference was just as important as the tactical one. Soldiers felt less burdened, more mobile, and more confident. The M16's accuracy also earned respect. Its high-velocity round shot flat, and at typical engagement ranges, 100 to 300 yards, it was devastating. Wounds caused by the tumbling, fragmenting bullet were shocking. Field surgeons described injuries far worse than those caused by the traditional rifle rounds. Critics who had dismissed the .223 as a varmint cartridge could no longer deny its lethality. In the hands of an infantryman, it was far from a toy. As the fixes took hold, Special Forces, Marines, and regular Army units alike began to adopt the M16A1 as their standard weapon. Slowly, the rifle's reputation in the field shifted. Veterans who had cursed it in the early days saw the difference. New recruits who never knew the disastrous first models accepted it as simply the rifle of their generation. By the early 1970s, the M16 was firmly entrenched as the backbone of American infantry. The rifle's redemption wasn't just technical, it reshaped doctrine. The shift from full-power battle rifles to lightweight assault rifles forced the enemy to rethink how squads fought. Automatic fire, once an afterthought in doctrine, became central. Ammunition logistics changed. The emphasis on long-range marksmanship gave way to firepower, maneuver, and sustained contact. In effect, the M16 forced the U.S. military to catch up with what the Germans and Soviets had already learned 2 decades earlier. Most battles are fought at close to medium range, and the soldier with more controllable firepower has the advantage. The rifle also became a political symbol. For critics of the Vietnam War, it was tied to the failures of the conflict itself, a black silhouette that evoked controversy, mistrust, and the sense of betrayal from its early years. For supporters, it was proof that the U.S. military could adapt and overcome, turning a flawed deployment into a success story. Either way, the M16 became inseparable from the image of Vietnam. Photographs of young men in flak jackets, M16s slung across their shoulders, became iconic. Beyond Vietnam, the M16 continued to evolve. The M16A2, introduced in the 1980s, incorporated lessons learned from decades of service. It featured a heavier barrel, new rear sights, improved handguards, and a 3-round burst option in place of full auto. The M16A3 and A4 followed, each refining the design further. The M4 carbine, a shortened descendant of the M16, became the standard weapon for U.S. forces in the 21st century, carrying Stoner's DNA into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. What had once been mocked as Mattel toy outlasted every one of its critics. The M14 faded into history, relegated to ceremonial duties and niche roles. Springfield Armory itself was shuttered in 1968, a casualty of the same changes that had doomed its last great rifle. But the M16 lived on, becoming the longest-serving rifle in U.S. military history. The irony is sharp. The rifle that nearly collapsed under the weight of sabotage and neglect became the weapon of choice for generations. Its early failures weren't a sign of poor design, but of poor leadership. Once freed from the politics of ordnance and the incompetence of its rollout, the M16 revealed its strengths. In the words of one Vietnam veteran, "It wasn't the rifle that failed us, it was the people who sent it to us without the things we needed." By the late 1960s, the M16 was no longer a scandal. It was the standard. Soldiers trained on it, trusted it, and carried it into battle without question. It had survived its betrayal in the jungle, endured the hearings in Washington, and emerged as the rifle that defined American infantry for the rest of the century. By the time the last American combat troops left Vietnam in 1973, the M16 had already endured as one of the most turbulent introductions of any weapon in U.S. military history. It had gone from being hailed as the rifle of the future to being cursed as a death trap, to finally proving itself as dependable workhorse once the fixes were in place. But the story of the M16 was never just about the rifle. It was about the institutions, politics, and the price paid when bureaucrats placed pride above soldiers' lives. The collapse of Springfield Armory in 1968 was more than a budget cut. It was a reckoning. The Army had once been the symbol of American rifle design, but its culture of insularity, nepotism, and resistance to innovation had left it obsolete. Its last product, the M14, had been a failure in the very environment it was supposed to prove itself. The M16's adoption, forced by Robert McNamara and refined through congressional oversight, marked the end of Springfield's monopoly. For the first time in more than a century, the design of American soldiers' rifle came from outside those walls. That shift reshaped the way the United States procured weapons. No longer would ordnance alone dictate the process. Civilian oversight, independent contractors, and Congress itself now played larger roles. That brought new problems: lobbying, politics, and the influence of industry, but it also ensured that no single institution could freeze the military in tradition again. The M16 was a product of this era, a rifle born not from the halls of Springfield, but from a small California think tank and a defense secretary who valued data over dogma. Yet the shadow of its introduction never completely disappeared. Among Vietnam veterans, the memory of the early M16s linger like a scar. Many can still recall the frustration of trying to clear a jammed chamber with an enemy bearing down, the helplessness of carrying a rifle they couldn't trust. Some lost friends in firefights where their weapons failed. For them, the congressional hearings and the later fixes were too little, too late. The betrayal was personal, and no amount of technical improvement could erase it. The bitterness colored the rifle's reputation for decades. Even as the M16A1 and later variants proved reliable, critics repeated the stories of jams and failures. For years, the M16 was dogged by a narrative that it was fragile, temperamental, and inferior to the rugged AK-47 carried by America's enemies. The irony is that by the late 1970s, the fixed M16 was as dependable as any rifle in the world, but reputations are harder to repair than rifles. The rifle's evolution into the M16A2 and beyond solidified its place in U.S. service. Each version addressed lessons learned in combat. The A2 added a heavier barrel, improved sights, and a 3-round burst option. The A4 introduced modular rails and optics compatibility. The M4 carbine, a shortened descendant, became the standard weapon of U.S. forces into the wars of the 21st century. For all their differences, each variant carried Stoner's DNA. The straight-line stock, the direct gas system, the emphasis on lightweight and controllable fire. The controversies of its introduction also influenced broader debates about small arms. The caliber wars never really ended. Even today, arguments rage over whether 5.56 NATO is sufficient, whether a return to larger calibers is necessary, or whether new technologies will redefine the rifle once again. The ghosts of Ordnance Old battles still haunt procurement meetings, though few would dare admit they are repeating history. What makes the M16 story unique is how much of it was decided not on the battlefield, but in committee rooms, hearing chambers, and corporate offices. Soldiers carried the weapons, but politicians, generals, and executives shaped its fate. When the system failed, when cleaning kits weren't issued, when the wrong powder was chosen, when the truth was buried, the price was paid in blood by men in the jungle. That fact gives the rifle's legacy a double edge. It is both a success story of adaptation and a cautionary tale about bureaucratic arrogance. And yet, for all the controversy, the M16 endured. No other U.S. rifle has served as long or been produced in such numbers. It has become as much of a symbol of American military power as the Garand was in World War II. For generations of soldiers, the sight of its black silhouette became synonymous with service. It was carried through rice paddies, deserts, and mountain passes. It has been photographed in every American war since Vietnam. For better or worse, it became part of the nation's identity. The legacy of the M16 is complicated. It is a story of betrayal and redemption, of lies exposed and lessons learned. It represents the end of Springfield's monopoly, the truth of innovation over tradition, and the painful truth that progress in the military often comes at terrible cost. Its controversies shape not only how rifles are designed and tested, but how soldiers view the institutions that arm them. Today, the descendants still serve, even as the military explores replacements like the XM7. The debates echo those of the past: stopping power versus weight, tradition versus innovation, promises versus reality. The story has not ended because the questions the M16 raised have never been fully resolved, but its place in history is secure. The black rifle that once betrayed soldiers in the jungle, that was nearly buried by ordnance, and that survived congressional scrutiny, became the longest-serving rifle in U.S. history. Its story is not neat or clean. It's messy, controversial, and written in the blood of those who carried it. But in that mess lies a truth. The M16 is not just a weapon. It's a mirror, reflecting the strengths and the failings of the system that created it. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please consider subscribing, comment, like, and share. Until next time, stand tall.